Hello friends, and welcome to our video lecture on topic D4.2 Stability and Change. This will be mostly core content with just a tiny little bit of additional higher level stuff at the very end of the video. Regarding questions, what features of ecosystems allow stability over unlimited time periods, and what changes caused by humans threaten the stability of ecosystems. Our objectives for today, we're going to look at methods for studying stability and change in ecosystems. We're going to talk about what even is this idea of stability with regard to ecosystems. We're going to talk about keystone species and their effects. We're going to look at some disturbances to the stability of ecosystems, so many disturbances. And then we're going to talk about rewilding as a possibility for putting back the stability of those ecosystems. And then we will wrap up with a look at ecological succession, which is our additional higher level content. There are several ways that we can study ecosystems, their stability, and then also looking at disturbances that might affect that stability. One way is by building some mesocosms. This is an example built by some of my students a few years ago. It's a container. In that container, we added all of the things, biotic and abiotic, that we think we need for a sustainable ecosystem. What's nice about these is that it is super easy to control lots of variables. I can manipulate what I want, control what I want, and then also easily collect data because this thing is sitting in my lab where all my tools are. Of course, real ecosystems are not in jars, and so there are some limitations to these. Perhaps my favorite strength of a mesocosm over doing a field study is that I can manipulate variables detrimentally and look at the effects on the mesocosm. I certainly am not going to want to introduce detrimental variables to a whole entire ecosystem and put that ecosystem at risk. So mesocosms, field studies, both ways that we can study, model ecosystem stability. I might prefer a mesocosm myself. But what even is this idea of stability in an ecosystem? So stability allows ecosystems to persist indefinitely. This image is taken from the Daintree rainforest in northern Australia, and we're pretty sure that it has been in existence for about 180 million years. There are lots of species that are endemic to that area. There are also some plant species from ancient families where most of the species of the families are extinct. There are very few that are still in existence or extant, and they exist only in this rainforest, which is really amazing. 180 million years of rainforest. In order for those ecosystems to maintain their stability, there are three big requirements. The first one is a steady supply of energy. This makes sense, and this is probably the easiest one to maintain. The sun supplies the majority of energy for ecosystems on the Earth, and it's a pretty reliable source. We also need to make sure that there is nutrient cycling with no leakages. This one's far more difficult because we humans tend to harvest nutrients from lots of ecosystems. If we take plants out of an ecosystem, there's going to be more erosion. That increase in erosion is going to remove nutrients from the soil, which means that things just cannot live the way that they used to live. We also sometimes will remove species through epidemics or by poaching. That's going to also lead to disruptions to that nutrient cycle, or rather those nutrient cycles. There's more than one. And then we also need to make sure that individual species have lots of genetic diversity. If we have clones, lots of genetic clones of an organism, any little pressure from the environment is going to wipe out the whole entire species. This is not good for our food webs, for ecosystems, and so genetic diversity with an individual species just helps it to persist, to stay healthy even when there are some environmental pressures. That is especially important for species known as keystone species. And these keystone species are those that have a disproportionate effect on the structure of a community. In this example, we're looking at some groundhogs. If we have a decrease in this keystone species groundhogs, a loss of them, then there's less prey, which means that the predators are going to decrease in number because they don't have enough food to eat. These guys are herbivores, and so what they do is help to reduce the height of grasses. They also do a lot of waste production, which is going to help with some nitrogen cycling. If the nitrogen is decreased because there are fewer groundhogs pooping, then there's going to be less healthy grass, which means that there are going to be fewer mega herbivores, fewer very large herbivores able to be sustained in this ecosystem. Now, if these guys aren't eating a whole lot of grass, we're going to have an increase in the grass cover, which is going to lead to a decrease in plant height because we're going to have more shrubs. But now we're going to have a loss of animals that are used to living in those grasslands. We're going to have fewer pollinators. We're also going to lose the burrows that the groundhogs build. Other organisms that take over those burrows are not going to have the habitats that they need. So guys like these ground owls don't have homes. They're going to decrease in number too. And so you can see that just by taking out one species from an ecosystem, if it is a keystone species, super important to the stability of the whole entire ecosystem, then we have a big problem in that ecosystem. Another example of a disturbance to an ecosystem stability is deforestation. When deforestation occurs, not only do we have a loss of trees, but we have an increase in erosion because fewer tree roots holding the soil in place means that big rains come, that soil gets washed away. A lot of the nutrients in the soil are taken away also. Some of those nutrients end up in the water supply, which leads to this process called eutrophication. We're going to talk about that in a couple slides. One of the other things that happens in deforestation is a reduction of transpiration. Remember that transpiration is the movement of water from the roots of a plant up the stem and out the leaves. Lots of trees means lots of transpiration. Lots of transpiration means lots of water vapor in the air. Lots of water vapor in the air means clouds. More clouds means rain. If I don't have lots of trees doing transpiration, there's less water vapor, there are fewer clouds, there's less rain. Less rain means not a rainforest. And then our rainforests, like the Amazon, become grasslands, and this is troublesome. We're quite worried about this idea of a tipping point when it comes to deforestation and other disturbances to ecosystems. Tipping points are that place of deforestation. So much deforestation has occurred that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to recover that forest area. Again, we're talking about turning the Amazon into grassland. What a loss for our planet. We humans absolutely need to harvest resources from ecosystems. We also need the earth. We need to eat. And so it is important for us to find ways to sustainably harvest resources to support the human population. When we take too many resources out of an ecosystem, we are at risk of having decreased numbers of decomposers. Those decomposers are super important for recycling in those nutrient cycles. We also need to make sure that we have those decomposers for detoxification of waste products. There are lots of organisms that feed off of, especially like ammonia, which is produced during protein digestion, one of the byproducts of protein digestion, and it's quite toxic. Ammonia is not good for living things, except that there are some decomposers that absolutely love to feed off of the energy that is stored in ammonia molecules. We need those guys to take care of the ammonia in the ecosystem, turn it into nitrates and nitrites that are usable by living things, aside from those particular bacteria. We also need to make sure that there's lots of energy availability. And again, this one tends to be the easier one if we're talking about the sun providing energy. But if we are looking at chemoautotrophs that require chemical reactions to supply energy, then we need to make sure that those chemicals are there. And they're not going to be there if we are removing resources unsustainably. People have done lots and lots of math to figure out what we call the maximum sustainable yield and the maximum economic yield. This one happens to be in reference to fishing, and we can see that as we put more effort into fishing, we're going to catch more fish, and this is good. But also, we have a cost for fishing. We have boats and we have nets and we need to pay the people. And so we can see the cost of fishing rising as we're trying to catch more fish. We're catching more fish. And at some point, and again, lots of really brilliant people have done lots of math to figure this out, there is a perfect point of what effort you put into fishing and how many fish you catch that's going to give you the maximum economic yield. You're going to make the most profit because the difference between your yield and the cost of fishing is at its maximum. This is where we all should fish. Some people get a little bit greedy and they're like, but no, I want more fish. I want to sell more fish. And so maybe we're going to bump up to this maximum sustainable yield. This is the point of how many fish we can take out of an ecosystem, but still have enough fish to continue taking fish out of that ecosystem. But some people get more greedy and they're like, no, I want to fish all the fish. What happens is twofold. Number one, we're going to run out of fish. We have disrupted the ecosystem so much that now it is no longer sustainable, and there's going to be a huge decrease in the number of fish that are even fishable. And also, the cost is going up quite a bit because it's harder and harder to find fish because we have fished so many fish out of this place, which means that our profit is decreasing. And so we need to make sure that people understand the process of sustainable resource harvesting, that we understand the idea of maximum sustainable yield, that trying to catch more fish is not always the best way to catch more fish. And there are other agricultural practices that can lead to some disruptions to the stability of ecosystems. Again, agriculture is a must. We need it. Humans need food. But we need to make sure that our agricultural practices are not so intensive that we are depleting resources in the ecosystem. We need to make sure that we have some lovely sustainable practices. Tillage is one of the practices that is pretty rough on ecosystems. So this is just loosening up soil so that it's easier to plant the seeds. The problem, though, with tillage is that it degrades the soil, it increases erosion, which means that the nutrients in the soil are going to run off with the water. This is going to lead to fewer nutrients in the soil and more in the water. We're going to talk about eutrophication on the very next slide. Mechanical tillers like these guys are often diesel powered, which means that we're burning more fossil fuels, which means that the carbon footprint of this guy is large and we're reducing the quality of the soil. This is not sustainable. Another practice that is a challenge for ecosystems is the idea of a monoculture. In monoculture agriculture, we are planting the same crop over a huge area. You can see here that this field goes on and on and on. This is super efficient for collecting the plants. However, over time, it's going to lead to an increase in pests and also weeds, which means that we need to use more fertilizer. We need to use more pesticides. That's going to lead to more resistance of the pesticides, which means that we need to use more and more and more. And these agrochemicals, pesticides and fertilizers, are often produced in factories that use fossil fuels to make them. And so again, we have a very large carbon footprint coming from the making of the chemicals needed to sustain these monocultures. So much better to have a diversity in our farms. And as promised, this idea of eutrophication. So what happens when we have lots of fertilizer in our soil, and then the rain comes down and the rain washes those fertilizers into a body of water? Now we have so many phosphates and we have lots of nitrates, and these help to make the plants, the algae, grow like magic. And it might feel like that's a great thing, like, oh my gosh, look at all the algae, it's so green and beautiful and lush. Except when we have these algal blooms, these big growths of algae, several things happen. Number one, all of this algae is going to block the sun, which means that we're not getting any light to lower levels of the body of water, which means that there's not any photosynthesis happening any deeper. And also, this crazy exponential growth in the algae is going to suck all the nutrients out of the water really fast. So the algae goes beyond its carrying capacity, and we have too many algae, which means that the algae are going to grow really fast and then die really fast. And then those algae, the dead ones, are going to sink or precipitate to the bottom of our body of water. And now we're going to have some decomposers making lots of ATP by digesting these dead algae. And when they make ATP, they need oxygen. And so now there's very little oxygen available in the water, which means that aquatic animals like fish are going to die. And also these decomposers, when they're breaking down huge amounts of algae really, really fast, lots of toxic substances are released, and they're released faster than the other decomposers can take them apart and turn them into less toxic things. Eutrophication, for a short moment, it looks kind of magical and beautiful and green. Oh my gosh, all the algae, it's growing so happy. But long-term effects are very detrimental to the whole entire ecosystem. Another issue with agrochemicals and other substances that are being put into the soil and then eventually into the water is this concept of biomagnification. This is especially true of compounds that are fat soluble instead of water soluble. What happens, just like in our pyramids of energy, how we have fewer and fewer things because the bunny rabbits that are here need to, that's a bunny rabbit by the way, they need to eat lots and lots and lots of plants in order to survive over their lifetime. What that means is that any little chemicals in the plants that the bunny eats over its whole entire lifetime are going to get stored up in its body over the course of its lifetime. And then should, I don't know, let's say an eagle comes. Oh, don't laugh at my eagle. Pretend like that's an eagle. So here comes an eagle and he eats 1 rabbit, 2 rabbits. How many rabbits over a lifetime? 100. Each of those rabbits is full of these agrochemicals. That means that the eagle is going to end up with more and more and more of those chemicals in its body. This is the idea of biomagnification. It happens also in aquatic ecosystems. So our producers, the algae, the phytoplankton, are going to have some of those negative chemicals in their bodies. When the zooplankton eat them, they're going to get a little bit more and they're going to hold on to them over the course of their lifetimes. Lots of fish are going to eat lots of these, which means that all of the pieces of the bad chemicals in the zooplankton are going to accumulate in the bodies of the fish. They're going to have more and more. The larger fish are going to eat lots of little fish, which means that they're going to have an increased concentration of these bad chemicals. And so over time, the parts per million, the concentration of these negative chemicals is going to build up. This also is true for us humans because sometimes we humans are part of these food chains and we can also eat the fish that have a lot of chemicals accumulated in them. And we're going to look at just one more example of disturbances to the stability of ecosystems, and that disturbance is plastic. Plastic can be considered a macroplastic. These are big pieces of plastic that are very easy for us to see. Water bottles, plastic bags, these are microplastics. They are bad for the planet. They're bad especially for aquatic ecosystems. Those plastic bags look like jellyfish, and so turtles eat them and they die with their bellies full of plastic, and it's horrible. Perhaps an even bigger concern is the idea of microplastics. These are tiny little pieces of plastic that can be produced when these macroplastics degrade into tiny little pieces. Sometimes also they are produced in personal hygiene products, so anything that has like little beads that are supposed to exfoliate your skin. Often those baby beads are made of plastic and then they go into the water and it's really, really bad. When we wash clothes that are composed of synthetic fibers, often some of those fibers wash away in the water, and if it's a synthetic fiber, it's probably plastic. And once again, we end up with these tiny little pieces of plastic in the water. They are going to accumulate biomagnification in the ecosystem, just like those chemicals that we looked at on the previous slide. So little fish eats a little bit of microplastics, and then the bigger fish eat, and the bigger fish eat. And then we humans are also eating microplastics. We have been found, as humans have been found, with microplastics in our bodies because we're putting them into the ecosystems. Plastic is also a challenge because the raw material that we use to make plastic, fossil fuels. Once again, we're pulling those carbon sources the sinks, the pools that we have, we're pulling them out of the planet and putting them back into the ecosystems, into the environment, into the atmosphere, which is going to lead to climate change, which is a video coming up soon. There are lots of consequences to us humans disturbing the stability of ecosystems. We lose biodiversity. There are lots of species that have gone extinct because we have manipulated ecosystems such that those species couldn't be sustained anymore. We also lose some of the services that ecosystems provide to us, like flood protection and water purification and air purification. In order to try to reestablish some of the stability of ecosystems so that we can gain back some of those pieces of biodiversity and those protections that ecosystems provide to us, one possible way to put the stability back is this idea of rewilding. So to rewild an ecosystem, the first thing that has to happen is that humans have to stop using it for whatever use was disturbing the ecosystem. Often this means that we have to stop farming that land. Sometimes that alone is enough for the ecosystem to recover and go back to what it used to be. Sometimes we have to add a few other interventions. We might need to spread some seeds of some of the native plants. We might need to reintroduce a keystone species. We might have to work pretty hard to control invasive species, but it can be done. Here we are looking at the Hinawai Reserve in New Zealand. It was farmland that has been returned to native forest. You can see the trees growing back. There were some invasive species, some alien species that were introduced as farm animals, goats, and then following that were possums and deer. They're alien. They are rigorously controlled on this land. The speed with which the land has recovered, this ecosystem has come back, has been remarkable, but there is still some risk to this ecosystem despite the progress that it has made because of extreme weather conditions. This land has been exposed to extreme drought and also flooding due to climate change, and so even though it's better, it's still not good. We're going to wrap up with a look at ecological succession, which is an additional higher level piece of content. So SL friends, you will not be assessed against these last couple pieces. HL friends, carry on. So this idea of ecological succession is that over time there is a succession, a progression of species in a space. Think about Hawaii. It came from volcanic activity. It started out as bare rock, but now it is magical in terms of its biodiversity. How did it get there? Well, that bare rock first started growing some pioneer species like moss or lichen. These pioneer species were able to break down the rock, get nutrients out of the rock, and that decomposition of the rock led to a layer of topsoil. That topsoil was able to maintain a population of grass. The grass kind of killed off the moss and the lichen, so it's not there anymore, but grass is cool. And after a while, there were more nutrients because more organisms came into this space to feed off the grass, and that allowed for the growth of bigger organisms like shrubs. And then there were more birds and more bugs and more small animals, which led to more nutrient cycling, which led to bigger plants, and then also more animals and more fungus and all the other super cool things. So we have this beautiful increase in biodiversity over time. Our primary production, remember that that's the grams of carbon that can be taken in per area over some unit of time. Our primary production is going to increase as we have bigger and bigger plants. Our food webs get more complex, more organisms can move into these ecosystems. Nutrient cycling is going to increase. More organisms means more death and more detritus and more decomposers. It's kind of amazing. The initiation of succession can be abiotic. It can be something like an avalanche led to the destruction of whatever ecosystem was there, and then it has to start from fresh. These successions can also begin with biotic factors. Sometimes beavers build dams that leads to floods that turns open water into swamp, and then we get all kinds of super cool ecological succession from there. Succession can be cyclical, or it can be arrested or stopped. In cyclical succession, we literally have a cycle. Here we've got this tiny little one herbivore eating the grass because he's not eating a whole lot of grass. The grass can grow taller. That little herbivore doesn't like to eat tall grass, but you know who does? This mega herbivore. He comes in and he eats all the grasses. But then they eat all the grasses, and so now there's not tall grass, there's small grass. So those little herbivores come back, but there isn't enough grass for all of them, and so the population declines. But then there's only one little herbivore eating the little grass, which means that the grass can once again grow taller, and so the migration of those mega herbivores will be back, and then the whole thing happens all over again. So we have a cycle. There is no one end point of succession. That's different from arrested succession, which is where we go from moss to grass to shrub to tree, and those trees are there with large animals indefinitely. We don't progress further than the tree. So we stop there at what we call, that by the way is supposed to be a big tree, we call it the climax community because it is the peak of what succession leads to. It is the coolest, the biggest, the most complex community that can exist in that space. Interestingly, we humans can sometimes lead to this idea of a plagioclimax community. In a plagioclimax community, we humans have led to some succession being arrested at a place that maybe it wouldn't have naturally. This happens when we have big herds of grazing animals, when we have our cows, our bison on the plains, or if we're in Africa, perhaps we have elephants. They're going to eat the grass, which means that the shrubs never come, and so it's always a grassland. It will never progress past grassland because these cows are making sure that shrubs can never grow. Another example of plagioclimax is when we drain waterlands. So when we drain swamps, when we drain wetlands to make more farm, we lead to a plagioclimax. We have a human-formed climax community. We humans really love to drain swamplands because the peat, remember that peat is that incompletely decomposed organic material. It is incompletely decomposed because it forms in waterlogged, look at all that water, slightly acidic anaerobic conditions. We're going to have super rich soil. So we drain the water out of the swamp. We have our farms there in that former swamp land, and stuff grows so good. Sometimes, though, we want to put those wetlands back because we know that it is important for us to have these watersheds so that our bigger bodies of water have been purified, are drained properly. That's actually what's happening here. So this is in Ohio in the United States. This is the Great Black Swamp, or it was, and it almost is again. So the Great Black Swamp was there. It is part of the watershed for Lake Erie, which is kind of between Michigan and Ohio and New York. And the swamp was drained, and there were bunches of farms. But now we're kind of rewilding, and we're allowing the water to fill back in that space. So we can still kind of see where there used to be some divisions for that farmland. No more. It's going back to swamp, which is really exciting for that space. And my friends, on that note, we have arrived at the end of our video lecture. Hopefully you are feeling confident about answering your guiding questions. Features of ecosystems allow stability over unlimited time periods. Those three important things. We have genetic diversity in species, especially the keystone species. We are not allowing the nutrient cycles to leak. We humans are not over harvesting the nutrients from the nutrient cycles. Then we have that constant energy supply. We also talked about the changes that we humans make to ecosystems that disturb their stability. We accomplished all of our objectives. We talked about using mesocosms to study the stability and changes in ecosystems. We talked about the importance of stability. We talked about those keystone species and how they have that disproportionate effect on an ecosystem, on the community within the ecosystem. We talked about lots of examples of disturbances to the stability of the ecosystems. We talked about forest fires. We talked about agriculture. We talked about fishing. But we can also help to put back some of those ecosystems through rewilding. And remember that ecology has a succession. We can have cyclical succession. We can also have arrested succession that leads to a climax community, or a community that we humans chose, the plagioclimax community. Great work today.